Hello, everybody. Just give it a couple of minutes for anybody else to join the webinar. So bear with me a moment. Um, Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome along to the fifth webinar in our series looking at ISO 27566. We're going to look at levels of confidence and indicators of effectiveness today. This is fifth of six overall. Last one being on Friday this week. My name is Tony Allen. I'm Chief Executive of the AgeCheck Certification Scheme. Just move that so it counts all the lights in the background. And I am the technical editor of 27566 on behalf of BSI in the UK and globally. And so the purpose of these webinars is to aid understanding and just give a brief introduction. They're not intended to be a very detailed introduction, just a kind of high level overview. And there is an opportunity to ask questions and to put something in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to keep an eye on those as we go through and pick those up at the end. But if you do want to ask a question, do just jump into the chat and stick something in there. But let's get going with this one. So we're going to talk about levels of confidence, sometimes known as locks or indicators of confidence, or levels of effectiveness. You will probably see this referred to as in various different ways. Broadly speaking, it doesn't really matter. I mean, to technical people it matters, but to the real world, it doesn't really matter whether you call it level of confidence, indicator of effectiveness, level of assurance, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. But the standard doesn't refer to it as indicators of effectiveness. And what they are is an easy way to look at a system and say, is that one more effective or less effective than others, a way to compare them. It's quite a difficult task, though, to compare age assurance systems, particularly across different modalities. So the way you measure and assess, for instance, a passport check with a liveness detection and a selfie match versus a face age estimation, that can differ. So it's not very easy to compare like with like. But in the international standard, it does talk about one particular indicator of effectiveness, which is classification accuracy. So that is the question: how likely is the component or the system to get the answer right? So if the question is this person over 18, and the system says yes, they are, what's the likelihood that that is a correct answer? That's the classification accuracy. So leaving all the others aside, and there are plenty of others that you can look at, that one there gives you a baseline as to how well the system performs. What it doesn't do is really talk about the breakdown of that into components, because you may well have a system that gives you quite high classification accuracy, but is built on 6 or 7 different components, which of themselves give you a certain indicator of effectiveness, which then add up to that classification accuracy. So when you sort of delve into the background to some of these things, it can get quite confusing. But I think just keep your focus of attention on the indicator of effectiveness being about how reliable the age and ID check is. None of them are 100%. None of the systems we've tested, none of the systems we've looked at, could we say that they are 100% effective. There will always be a degree of false accept and false reject rates. And that's because these systems are doing an analysis at distance. So even if you're doing an age verification using a passport and a driving license and an ID check and a selfie match and a binding mechanism, there's still a capability for them to be wrong. It could be the wrong driving license for the wrong person. It could be the wrong data that's been extracted. It could be that the selfie match wasn't actually the person that's on the document. It could be that there's been a spoof document added, which has had the date of information altered and has been accepted. So they are still capable of being wrong. But the more you are looking at the at data, looking at the information, looking at multi-factor authentication, the less likely they are to be wrong. But I would just suggest you never say this has got to be 100% accurate. You won't find one that's 100% accurate. There are different risks that you have to consider. To be more effective or to be more accurate requires a greater degree of potential intrusion into the private information that you need about an individual, greater friction in the journey, and potentially requires more privacy impact for the process. So you have to make sure that you're not over specifying the level of the indicator of confidence based on the risk of the analysis that you're doing. So you might have a relatively low risk for certain access to basic social media, for instance, and a relatively high risk if you're getting into extensive gambling. The other thing is that the difference between somebody going into a shop to purchase a highly caffeinated drink versus the age of a child or a young person in an adult video is just totally different ends of that risk spectrum. So you would very much expect the level of assurance that that person that's in that adult video is not a child to be significantly higher than necessarily that person buying that energy drink is not a child. So this is all about proportionality and risk management. So you've got to get that right. So you've got to map the required level of confidence to the risk context. So think about the use, the deployment, whether or not, for instance, the deployment is supported by other activities. So, for instance, you could have an age estimation tool that is on a counter of a shop, and it just flashes green or flashes red to the checkout operator to indicate to them that they might either need to ask for ID or probably don't need to ask for ID on the basis of an age estimation. So in that retail scenario, the indicator of how effective that is, how likely it is to get that right, is not as high as other scenarios. So because you still got the person there, the checkout operator, who, yes, they may be relying on the green red, but if they get that wrong, they're not going to be far off, and they can still obviously see somebody that is in store, maybe playing around with a mask or trying to tamper with the system or trying to spoof the system because it's in a live environment. So therefore, the level of confidence you need in that and the indicator of effectiveness you need of it isn't as high as some other things. Then when you get into some of the more medium to high risk categories, these might be where you are doing things that are highly regulated. So we use gambling there as an example. So gambling, you've got a 3-stage age assurance process where everybody that sort of enters the space should be over 18, but you're in a relatively medium risk area there as to whether if they weren't over 18 at that point, they may be doing free play, they may be doing other things. You've then got the stage whereby when they place an actual bet, and then you've got the stage at when they may claim a payout of winnings. So you've got three stages there, and the risks associated with each are different. So you might use different techniques, and therefore have different levels of confidence at each of those stages. A simple age estimation at a relatively low indicator of effectiveness might be good enough to stop somebody entering a site and just playing around, versus a check against an age assurance record or database or token when they place a bet, versus maybe full verification of them and sanctions checks and politically exposed persons checks and all sorts of other stuff that goes with maybe making a payout on a claim for winnings. And then you've got very, very high risk areas. And I mentioned the one where you're looking at the age of actors and actresses that are in adult entertainment. Are they over 18? Are they adults in order to participate in that activity and have that information shared? And of course, there are huge, extensive consequences for sharing sexualized material of children under the age of 18. And so that's an incredibly high risk area. You want to have therefore a high degree of confidence and strong proof of age in that space. So how do we define all of this? The standard goes into, or part one of the standard goes into a relatively high level of definition. But part three of the standard goes into much more detail about indicators of effectiveness and the definitions and the measures. So part three is currently at the committee draft stage and still working its way through. Part one sort of establishes the concept of indicators of effectiveness, but doesn't necessarily delve into the detail. When we come to the certification scheme, of course, we're using detail, and we're using part three as it currently stands. We're also using the IEEE 2089.1, and we're using other methods of measurement, including the product quality model and software testing models that are elsewhere in settled standards that have been around for a few years. So accuracy. So we've already said accuracy, classification accuracy is the likelihood the system gets the answer right. So you measure that through a confusion matrix of false accept, false reject, true accept, and true reject. And obviously what you're looking for there is a very high true accept and true reject rate, and a low false accept and false reject rate. So a false accept rate is where somebody who is under the age restriction or doesn't meet the age-related eligibility requirement is accepted. And that means somebody who's 16 gets through an age 18 gateway and is allowed to purchase the goods. And those you want to minimize. A false reject is where somebody who is over the age-related eligibility requirement, so somebody, if the age-related eligibility requirement is 18, so somebody who's like 20, and they are rejected because the system is unable to verify that they are 20. Obviously, you want to reduce those, but they're not as critical as the false accepts. They are effectively bad news for the person who's old enough to get that product, but a customer service issue rather than a potential commission of an offence or the allowing a young person onto a system. So you want to look at both of those, but you want to particularly focus on the false accept rate. You also want to look at the coverage of the system, so whether or not it's got the bandwidth and the capability to check many users at once. And you could have systems that are doing multi-million checks per second in the scale of things that are happening and access to things. That tends to be, those spikes tend to be short lived, and they may come on the back of the launch of a new system or the change in legislation, and they tend to sort of tail off to a more background level, but you need to be able to look and see whether or not the systems have got those capabilities. We also assess the user experience, so how long it takes to return a result, how easy it is to flow through. And when we do certification, we look at the drop-off rate. So how many people gave up? It shouldn't be a test of attrition. It should be a relatively smooth process. And typically these things are completed within 5 to 8 seconds, depending on whether you are having to upload something like an ID or whether you are going through an inference or an estimation process. We will also look at the privacy preserving effectiveness and the security effectiveness of the system. So how well is that data protected? How well is it minimized? How well are you ensuring that the user's rights and data security are being respected? So then it comes to the very interesting question of thresholds. We have four headline indicators: basic, effective, highly effective, and strict. And these are set out in the IEEE 289. They're not set out in 27566. They may be set out in part 3 in more detail, but in part 1 they just basically refers to you can have these different levels. You will see this referred to in regulations or guidance for regulations around the world. So you might see that certain requirements in the Online Safety Act in the UK, for instance, are required to be done using highly effective age assurance, HEAA as it's sometimes being referred to now. And some are simply requiring that it's an effective level of age assurance, or that it's basically covers the bases. We haven't seen anywhere asking for strict levels in regulation, but we are certainly seeing some relying parties apply relatively strict levels, particularly for things like the upload of video content and that sort of material. It's open to regulators to set thresholds. Most of them don't. A couple of them have, but most of them don't. But of course, as a certification body, we've got to assess it against a threshold. So our threshold for classification accuracy for the component or the system, if we're doing component or system, is for basic, it's got to be 80% accurate. For effective, it's got to be 90%. For highly effective, it's got to be 95%. And for strict, it's got to be 99% classification accuracy. Obviously, if you are operating in a specific context or in a specific jurisdiction, and those levels differ in those jurisdictions, we would apply the level that applies in that jurisdiction or that context of use. So when you come to certification, you would need to think about where you are wanting to undertake your product and service, where you're wanting to supply it, and then think about the context and the regulations that are going to apply in those local jurisdictions. So what's important then is when you are looking at the sale of your age assurance system, or you're looking to procure an age assurance system, you need to be able to specify what the right level of assurance is for the service that you're providing, where you're providing it, in the context that you are providing it. So your system needs to be adaptable to those different contexts. And it doesn't necessarily work that, say you've got a system which is strict and meets the strict level, that's going to be fit for purpose for something that only requires basic. And the reason for that is that in order to meet that strict level, you may have to collect quite a lot of data and quite a lot of information about that individual, maybe multi-factor information, to get to that 99%. If that's not required for the level of assurance that's required for the particular context of use, then you would potentially be in breach of data protection legislation by over collecting information that wasn't necessary for the purpose of meeting the age-related eligibility requirement and the policy requirement for that particular sector and that particular risk. So it's really important that you've got an adaptable system, or that you're very clear about where this can be used, and that is part of your practice statements that are assessed through the certification process. So your procurement specification, if you're a relying party, can say, we want you to be ISO 27566 certified, and we want you to be able to demonstrate that you are an effective age assurance system. And it can say, for instance, not a strict age assurance system because that's too high, or it can say that not a basic because it's too low. So you've got to be, as a relying party, you've got to be clear about exactly what you are specifying, and that is linked back to the particular product or service or age-related eligibility requirement that you have. So going back to some examples there, that using those retail sites with a high level of confidence is going to give you unnecessary friction, lost users, and potentially is going to be an over collection of data. Using a low check on a gambling site is potentially going to give a greater level of underage access, and that could be a regulatory breach depending on which level you're talking about, whether that is just trying to stop access for free play, or whether it's actually placing a bet, or whether it is, which would be the commission offence if they're underage, or whether it is the withdrawal of winnings, which, of course, if they're underage, should result in a void bet or a void transaction. If you're using insufficient verification on adult content, that can lead to quite substantial legal risks. The sharing of underage images of children in sexualized positions, for instance. It can also lead to reputational damage if you're operating a site which has got access to adult content and you're not carrying out the checks that need to be undertaken. So if you get that wrong, that mismatch between the level of confidence and the risk context, you can get the whole basis of your compliance check wrong, and you can over-specify, under-specify, get that in the wrong place. And this is all part of your 27566 certification. If you come to us as an age assurance provider, we will examine what the performance characteristics are in your classification accuracy, but we will also examine how you then describe that in your practice statement and how you describe that to clients. If you come to us as a relying party, as a client of those, we will explore how you specify what age assurance system you need for the purpose you're undertaking, and your risk analysis and risk assessment of that to make sure that you are specifying the correct level. And then we'll make sure that whatever you've implemented matches that correct level that you've specified. Thinking about over specification as well as under specification. We will also look at other indicators of confidence as well. So we may just briefly talk about indicators of effectiveness in relation to, for instance, the outcome error parity. So is it treating different demographic groups in a similar manner, in a similar way? We will also look at whether or not there are secondary measures that might be applicable. Often these could be particular to a particular type of age assurance system. Such as a face age estimation. You might find information about the mean absolute error of the age range. You might find information about standard deviation. The secondary measures do tend to get a little bit more statistical and complex, which can be a bit too much detail. Obviously, what we're aiming to do is to create a system whereby you have a relatively easy way to describe your product to the relying parties, and then onwards to consumers and users of the system. So that's the end of today's relatively short webinar on indicators of effectiveness. Key things to remember from this are the 4 levels: basic, basic, effective, highly effective, and strict. The minimum classification errors for those are 80% basic, 90% effective, 95% highly effective, and 99% strict. And then making sure that you specify the right level for the right risk context for your product and your service. I am very happy to take any questions or any queries on that. Do put those up into the chat. If you haven't got any questions you want to ask on the webinar, then do drop us a line or an email, and we're happy to answer those questions. We're also happy to talk about starting your ISO 27566 certification journey with us. But let's just look and see if there are any questions in the chat. It doesn't look like there are any so far. So I'll just remains for me to let you know that the final webinar is on Friday, the 10th of October, this coming Friday. It's at 12 noon BST. And it's the last one in the series. And this one's about the actual certification process. So what will happen when you start your certification journey? But there being no questions, I think I can bring this to a close. Thank you very much for attending.